As a standing lift, with the barbell pressed above the body, the press has a few unique biomechanical considerations. So let's get into them. The first is that the lifter must consider three separate points of balance: the arm and barbell system over the shoulder joint when the lifter is in the overhead position, the forearm barbell system and that center of mass over the elbow joint in the rack, and then the combined lifter and barbell system as that center of mass affects midfoot over the entire course of the lift. So in the overhead position, we see that the lifter on the left is stacked, the humerus is straight up and down, and the barbell, if we represent the barbell center of mass, is this red dot, and then the lifter's arm center of mass is this blue dot, then the actual center of mass of the barbell arm system is somewhere here around the green dot, more towards the red than the blue, because the barbell represents more of the system weight in this system. On the right, although the lifter is in balance at the feet, the arm bar system is anterior to the shoulder. So the deltoids, their pulling vector being represented by this blue arrow, are having to flex the shoulder against the load of the system. So the force of that system being here along the moment arm here pictured in red. Because the deltoids are already very shortened at the top of the lift, this is a very difficult moment arm to manage, and the lifter will often fatigue over a set, or not hold the bar in this position, instead punching it into that position, then pulling it right back down. In the rack position, the moment the barbell is no longer resting on the anterior deltoid, if it ever rests there at all, the elbow joint is the point of rotation for the mass above the elbow joint, including the forearm and the barbell. And the shoulder is the point of rotation for the entire arm barbell system. Now, because for various reasons, the entire system being very, very close to the body and the greater muscle mass supporting the shoulder, the lifter can usually support this position from the perspective of the shoulder, but it can be difficult as the moment arm rises, with the elbow getting farther and farther away from the bar. Now, the entire lifter is also a system in balance. On the left, the lifter has laid back. Although the shoulders are now behind the bar, giving gravity at this moment a longer moment arm on the shoulder joint, the bar remains about over midfoot and the hips have eased forward, so the entire system is in balance at the feet. A key consideration for the press, especially for variants of the press, is that the lifter has less power and control when applying force to the bar out of balance. But in dynamic moments, where upward drive from the legs or hips has placed upward momentum on the bar, the lifter may lose balance briefly, so long as they can reclaim it before they begin to apply maximum force to the bar. We're going to take a look here at barbell logic coach Brooke Haubenstricker and see how she manages this problem. So you'll see here she is stacked. The barbell, the system center of mass over the middle of the foot, everything looks all right here. She throws the hips forward aggressively. And right at this moment, the bar remains straight where it was, straight up and down in space. The shoulders go back a little, the hips come forward quite a bit, and her weight has just barely shifted towards the toes. That aggressive hip throw begins an upward rise on the bar, and we see here that she has returned her weight back to midfoot, and now her shoulders are behind the bar, hips are significantly in front of the bar, and so the bar has actually come slightly behind midfoot to keep this entire system center of mass in balance. You can see here where the heavier mass, or a heavy mass, is slightly behind. The shoulders, which maintain a decent amount of mass, are behind, and the hips are quite a bit forward. So as she begins to rise, bringing the shoulders and the hips closer to the center, the bar will come closer to the center, come closer to midfoot, and we'll see that as the bar moves forward slightly as she applies force. Just like in other lifts, Her system's center of mass remains over midfoot the entire time, but we see now how the shoulder, bar, and hips all three affect the entire barbell lifter system to keep her in balance at the moment when she needs to apply great force onto the bar. So as a general summary of what we're looking for in terms of biomechanical considerations, we need a stable rack as a platform for the press. If the elbows are too far forward, we don't have quite that same stable rack that we need because the moment arm and the triceps will be too great, and we'll discuss that more later. The lifter has to balance the needs of bar movement while maintaining two center of masses over two bases of support. So the lifter needs to balance the need to get the bar back over the shoulder joint from its starting position, while at the same time keeping the barbell within a limited range over the elbow, and then as the bar gets past the shoulder joint, getting it back over the shoulder so as to minimize extra moment on the shoulder joint, in a direction, the sagittal plane, that the deltoids are not in a position to handle. So the bar has to get back over the shoulder joint, and that movement is relative, not absolute travel. We can see here, going back to our side view, that the barbell is in fact significantly anterior to the shoulders at the start. So the barbell will need to move in relation to the lifter significantly far back to get back over the shoulder joint. However, the bar will travel a near vertical line, and we'll see that in our next video. When it comes to describing differences in anatomical considerations for the press, we have to start with the scapula. It's a key component in the press as it serves as the governor of shoulder movement. The glenoid, the cup which receives the humerus on either side, is part of the scapula, and its movement allows the shoulder its freedom of movement. Briefly, let's review the movements of the shoulder. So first, in any plane of movement, raising of the shoulder joint is abduction, and then lowering from above down is adduction or adduction. Specifically in the sagittal plane, abduction is flexion, and because in the sagittal plane the arms have the ability to extend their range of motion, we have extension behind the center line of the body. If I start with the arms above, or really from any position, bringing the arms closer to center is horizontal adduction, adduction, or abduction, abduction. We have internal and external rotation of the shoulder joint, which specifically in this case is referencing the humerus or the humeral head rotating on the glenoid. We have elevation and depression of the scapula, so there's very little range for depression of the scapula, but elevation, what we would call a shrug. And then we have protraction and retraction, the sliding back and forth, or the adduction and abduction of the scapula along the ribs, which pins the shoulder blades back or rolls them forward. Many of these movements are interrelated. Elevation of the humerus, for instance, starts with glenohumeral movement alone, but then the scapula must rotate upwards in order to make that happen, which we'll see in the next slide. So let's discuss a key component in the press and bench both, which is flare. Flare describes horizontal abduction of the shoulder while the lifter is holding the bar. Because of the constraints of the hand holding the bar, it is relevant in a few key ways. First, flare will inevitably cause posterior travel of the bar. So let's say the lifter has stopped in mid-motion right here. Flare, horizontal abduction, will cause posterior travel of the bar. If the body is moving forward while the bar moves posteriorly in relation to the body, absolute or actual bar travel may be near vertical, though the relative position moves back several inches over the shoulder. The lifter's challenge is to use flare effectively. If the lifter's elbow travel outpaces and actually gets behind the bar, as here, it will tend to push the bar forward and disturb a smooth bar path that will make the lift more efficient. Anthropometrically, the forearm to upper arm comparison will change the relative starting height of the bar when all else, specifically shoulder protraction, horizontal abduction, and flexion, so the position of the elbow and shoulder in relation to the rest of the lifter, is equal. You can see the relationship between the bar and the shoulder, so talking here, for the lifter on the left compared to the lifter on the right. Because USSF competition rules required that the bar be under the chin to start, you can see the compensatory starting position and chin lift for the lifter on the left. It's a useful metric for consistency of execution that the lifter can get their bar under the chin in training, but anthropometry will make it a challenge for some. This lifter has a longer forearm than his upper arm, and so he will struggle more to get his bar underneath the chin. Additionally, when constraints are tighter, as they are in the Olympic lifts where the bar must sit on the anterior deltoid and the elbows must be raised very high, some lifters will not be able to get there with a full grip with an unfavorable arm proportion. Now, we have the funnel concept again, but it's slightly different here in the press. So we talked earlier about how there's greater moment on the elbow if the elbow is far forward of the bar in the front rack. We see here, lifters will tend to favor a particular, the elbow being slightly forward of the bar. Technically, that's an additional moment on the elbow. Ideally, by the math alone, you would want the turning point or the point of rotation for the elbow directly underneath the bar, specifically the bar forearm system. However, as we lift, there's a tendency, standard variance in how the arm moves. I mean, we're not perfect machines, and it is far worse for the lifter if the elbow gets back behind the bar. It's much more difficult to control, as we see here. So we get a funnel again, where the lifter tends to stay a little bit forward of a perfectly vertical elbow underneath bar position. And then as the weight rises and as the bar rises, the elbow will flare out just a teeny bit to get closer underneath the bar as it needs to, but ensuring that that elbow supports and facilitates getting the bar back rather than coming behind the bar, which tends to push it forward. If the elbow gets too far forward, however, there's tension in the tricep because there's already a moment, even in the rack, a moment of flexion, so the tricep becomes taut. And as soon as the bar goes up, the tricep will want to unload that weight forward, and you'll see that when the elbow is very far forward as a spring forward of the bar. We have another linkage to consider. If the lifter has their bar underneath their chin, they have to get it out of the way in order for the bar to have a relatively vertical path. So straight vertical initially, and then posteriorly relative to the lifter as they make it over the shoulder joint. The lifter has two ways to solve this problem. They can either very slightly move the hips forward, which will pull the chin back because of the link between the hips and the hips and the back segment, or as this CrossFit video, which is publicly available, demonstrates, the lifter can tuck their chin back and tuck their head back to facilitate the bar getting out of path for a vertical lift. Another consideration is that sometimes a lifter will use different portions upstream and downstream of the shoulder to accommodate incomplete flexion. Here, we see how the lifter is overextending their thoracic spine in order to shorten this angle between the humerus and the chest and the thoracic spine because the shoulder or the humerus hasn't made all the way to a vertical position. Additionally, they bend the wrists, which brings the bar back over the shoulder joint without an actually vertical humerus. This is a common trick that we'll see for lifters as they try to skimp out on shoulder flexion by bending the bar back to get that less moment position, or rather where the moment is more favorable stacked on top of the shoulder joint. The press can help a lifter improve flexibility and serve as a diagnostic of mobility only if the coach keeps them or moves them towards an upright position with straight wrists, which will work the shoulder through its full range of motion. Another consideration, and one that creates significant debate on the internet, is the shrug. Some people recommend that you shrug hard from the very start of the lift. Others recommend it only as a finisher at the top, and then some say you shouldn't shrug at all, or that you should even do the opposite and pull the shoulder back into the socket. The common justifications for why we should shrug is that a shrug prevents impingement. So if the humerus were to elevate or rise, and the acromion were not to rise, so there's the acromion process of the scapula right here, and we have the coracoacromial arch. So there is a tunnel in which the supraspinatus tendon is passing under. And if the humerus rises without this section rotating up, as we saw earlier, as happens in the lift, then you could get impingement between the bony structures of the arch and the supraspinatus tendon. The idea is that the fibers of the traps, and you can see their orientation here, how they would assist in superiorly rotating the scapula up, which would point the glenoid humor, or the glenoid process right here, up and out of the way of the acromion. The acromion would point up so the humerus could raise unimpeded. The challenge here is that the traps, not only are the traps not the only muscles that contribute to it, for the beginning, they're not even the major ones. So older anatomical texts show while the person is standing, the traps having a significantly perpendicular angle and causing shoulder shrug, facilitating that and superior raising of the scapula. But more modern studies that have carefully assessed find that when the arm is at rest, the traps are actually in a very poor position to upwardly rotate the scapula. Instead, they attach the acromion and the clavicle both, so on both sides, and move them backwards and medially, more what we would think of as more towards scapular retraction. Only when the arm is raised, and we see here the arm is raised to 90 degrees and the scapula has already upwardly rotated, do the traps assist in that movement effectively. So there are some benefits to the shrug. When executed in the second half of the movement, anecdotally, it appears to help lifters who get stuck in the overhead position, can't get that full range of motion. You can do the same if you do what's called a shoulder dislocate with a wooden dowel, and then as you reach the sticking point, shrug through that position, and you will be able to continue the bar's rearward motion when before you might not have been able to. Additionally, it's possible that natural scapulohumeral rhythm, so that upwards rotation of the scapula as the arm raises, that's called scapulohumeral rhythm, may be disrupted under load or under a too heavy load. So when it gets heavy, the traps in the top half of the lift can assist when otherwise they might not be necessary. Our recommendation is to experiment with it. Have the lifter add it in the latter half of the movement, and don't overdo it. But if they start to experience shoulder pain or are having difficulty getting the bar over the shoulder joint, it is definitely a consideration and a tool that you can use. Some final anatomical considerations. This study, Thoracic Position Effect on Shoulder Range of Motion Strength and Three-Dimensional Scapular Kinematics, found that when a lifter is in thoracic flexion, so they are slumped or rounded, they are not only able to generate less force, but they have less range of motion in the shoulder. This may be one reason why a lifter struggles to get the bar into position. If they are not proud-chested in the beginning of the lift, it can actually affect scapular positioning and its ability to get to the finished position of the lift. And then in Anatomy and Biomechanics of the Shoulder, one of the things that was discovered after extensive cadaver studies is that in fact a little bit of external rotation is needed for the humerus to clear the acromion process. So much of the impingement that was believed to be caused by the rising of the humerus and the acromion not moving is actually caused by the humerus not rotating externally. That is assisted by keeping a proud chest. Thoracic extension assists with external rotation, and sometimes a change in grip position or a direct cue can help a lifter who is struggling to get through a catching point or a sticking point in the shoulder.